All right. So, anybody doing the interviews? Okay, I'll send you, I'll put up here on the screen an email address you can send them to. So our next speaker comes to us also from Indiana, from Purdue University in Indiana. They just, let's see, they won their basketball game last night. All right, so that's all good. Andrew McGregor is a graduate student in history at the University of Purdue. He's been doing digital history and that sort of thing since he was an undergraduate at the University of Nevada? Or Baker University. Yeah. And that's in Kansas?
Yep.
Okay. So he's been doing it for quite a while. He also is, he publishes an online sport history blog, which is fairly interesting. If you're interested in sport history, you might want to check that out. And with that, I'm going to get out of the way and let him tell you about all the cool things he's doing. So help me welcome Mr. McGregor.
Thanks. There it is. Kind of dark, sorry. Yeah, so this is this isn't, okay, let me switch this over here so you can hear me. There we go. Yeah, so you can't read it, it's in blue. It's ussporthistory.com is my blog. And I'm going to talk through some different ways of doing digital history, some different digital history projects I've worked on, but particularly around the topic of sports. I heard a lot of you guys were talking about sports projects earlier. For those of you here at Ohio Northern, most people are interested in sports, and sports history is a way to sort of get interested in larger questions of history. Sports help you learn about communities and different other things. So I think there's a lot of things we can do with sport history. So, but first off, I want to think about this as a way. How many of you have written a paper for a class? What happens to that paper after you turn it in? It's graded. What happens after it's graded? You throw it away, right? And who reads it? You read it, maybe. Most of the time you read your paper and you edit it. I know some of my students don't read theirs before they turn them in, but I wish they did. So you at least read your paper and your instructor reads your paper, but usually nobody else is going to read that paper. And so you spend hours researching in the library or on Google or whatever you're using now, and you do your citations and you write these papers, and nobody reads it except for you and your teacher. That seems like a waste of a lot of work, right? So I want to think about how can we give a second life to our papers by using digital history. I'm going to start with a project that I did when I was an undergrad. Let's see if we can get out of here real quick. Okay, so I did, I went to a small college about the size of Ohio Northern, maybe even a little bit smaller. We had about 1,000 students. And I ran track there way back when. And we had to write a senior thesis. I know some of you were talking about your senior thesis. It had to be, 25 pages or whatever. And I chose to study the history of track and field at my alma mater, Baker University. And back when I wrote it, I did all this research, I compiled all this data, and I wrote this project that nobody was going to read but me and my teacher. And that seemed like a shame. So what I did was I put it together and I put it on a website. And so this is one example of something you can do with a paper. I did the website much later. I didn't do it when I was an undergraduate. I did it later. But this is a way that you can take something you're already doing and give it a second life. I broke it down into 3 or 4 sections. Each section's, a couple of pages of my thesis. I could embed photos that I had from, so you see a photo here. This is from the yearbook. It was the program. So this is the first track and field meet ever at Baker University in 1904. You can see sort of the events. They ran the 100-yard dash. I think you can see this. So the 100-yard dash, you have, who won. OU is, I think, Ottawa University, Emporia, some other places. And so this is the results. They had it in the yearbook. And so you can sort of see, okay, this is the actual website, or the actual results. But then you can flip that back into me talking about what I actually found. You give your quotes and other things. So this is a way of taking my paper and showing my actual sources, but then also giving it to people who can go see this. So there's alumni that are interested. My undergrad university didn't have any history of their track and field program. They didn't know how good they were. They didn't know who all the coaches were. They didn't know how they finished at conference from year to year. So on another section, I put together a year-by-year results. So this is really basic. Here's the coaches. Here's here's how they finished. Here's the conference they were in. You'll notice it's not until around 1979, 1980 that they add a women's team. I think I add that on here. I'm not sure. Eventually, yeah, there's the women's team. It's not till 1980. So there's different ways you do this. So some of it is the narrative history, the different parts of it, but some of it is just compiling data that nobody's found before. And you can use this with a lot of different really interesting types of research. So let's take a step back. We think about, how do you do history? If you're writing history, how do you approach doing history? What are some of the things that you look for? Yeah.
Primary and secondary sources.
Yeah, primary and secondary sources. What do you do once you find these primary and secondary sources? Yeah.
Find the facts versus the opinions, put the facts in the ones that it's not biased.
Okay. So you separate facts and opinions and you analyze them a little bit to see what's biased, what's not biased. Are there any other things you do to make sense of your primary and secondary sources? Yeah.
Cite stuff you get from the websites.
Okay, so you cite them. Is there any other things that you would do if you were going to, so basically you say you read a bunch of newspaper articles, how are you going to make sense of them? Does anybody outline? You make timelines? Yeah.
Kind of organizing into the categories.
Okay.
Time, you can organize into what subjects they cover and stuff like that.
Yeah, so organizing them by time, theme, subjects. Does I see another hand over here? Does somebody have something? No? Okay. So what I'm trying to get you to think of is, so when we do history in 3 or 4 different ways. There's the first basic way is historical recording. So this data right here is me taking data, me doing research, and I'm recording it. I'm saying, this is what I found. So I read all the newspapers, I found the coaches, I found the conferences, I found where they finished. Most of the years, some years I didn't find it. You can see that there's some years that are blank here. But this is historical recording, and this is historical research. And it's a perfectly valid, normal form of research. The second step is what you guys are hinting at, is what I would call analysis. So once you have this data, what does this mean? Why does it matter that this was the coach, and this is when he coached, and this is how his teams did? What's the significance of that? Why does that matter? Yeah. So you want to know if he's successful, and that matters for various reasons. Yeah. Yeah, you can see their improvement. So you can see, they're second and third. They're on their 8th here. So what happened? Why did they go from 4th to 8th, right? So you can see how they improve or how they disimprove, right? What are some other things that you want to find out when you're studying history? From basically raw data like this. Consistency, yeah. Another form of raw data. So this is maybe not the best form of raw data. I think I have this on here. I don't have it on here, but you could, instead of this, you could look at the records. So you could go, how have the school records changed every year? And that's another way we could look at consistency. You can see who's important. But this sort of privileges success, right? Everybody studies sport history, wants to think about the winning team. Does anybody care about the losing team? Why don't we care about losers? But don't they have an important story to tell?
They do, it's just people don't acknowledge it.
Yeah, right. Why
They don't acknowledge it because they lost.
Because,
As the other team, because they didn't win what they were fighting for.
Right, so they're not important because they lost. I think we can look at ways to make them important. So again, why did we finish less here? And so you do that, you take the data, and then you find out, okay, I want to know who is this coach, I want to know why he lost, I want to know what he did. And so you can, this is the beginning of doing something much larger, right? So you compile the data, and then you go find the other pieces. So part of what I did in this project was, in the mid-50s, it's not on this list, they had their first ever national champion. He ran the 220-meter low hurdles. It's an event that doesn't exist anymore. Basically, it would be like the 200 meters, 220 yards, so now 200 meters. Low hurdles, which are like lower than low, lower than the intermediate, which is the 300 now, right? So it's a really odd event. And so I interviewed this guy, and I asked him about his success, but I also asked him, why were you the only one? So you can even talk to this, and he said the coach didn't know what the hell he was doing. And so part of that is understanding who are these coaches, who putting them in this larger context. So you have the data, then you have to think about what else is going on at Baker University, what else are these coaches doing. And in the process of finding this out, I found some really interesting things. Have you ever heard of Edward C. Gallagher before? Anybody heard of Edward C. Gallagher? Have you ever heard of Oklahoma State?
Yeah.
Where do they play basketball? Their arena is called the Gallagher Iba Arena. GIA is what some people, this is the same Edward Gallagher. Nobody knew that he was coaching for 3 years in 1914 at Baker University. And so I was able to sort of say, okay, this is the beginning of his coaching career. He came here for 3 years, and then he was hired back and left for Oklahoma State. So you can sort of think about, from this raw data, you can connect it to larger history. So it's not just a history of Baker University, or it's not just a history of Ohio Northern. You can figure out how do you fit in with these larger scale histories. And by putting it online, you can have other people. So I've had people find this website, and they're like, oh, I want to know more about this. Can you tell me about his record at Baker University? A similar guy, Carl Schladman, went on to coach at the University of Kansas, Michigan State, Washington State, several other major schools. He was one of the founders of the Kansas Relays, which is a major track and field meet. Again, he starts here and then he leaves later on. Let's see, I'll move down. George S. Brittenall, who's arguably the most successful coach in the mid-30s, was an Olympian. He was on the 1920 Olympic team in the 400-meter relay. So I could figure out his information, put him in context, and say, okay, they were really successful early on because they had these big name, really successful coaches. So you can look at the success. But having that information, then I can say, okay, why are they bad in the 60s and the 50s and the 70s? Well, they're basically coached by the football coach. So the football coach is like, well, I have to have my athletes healthy, and I have to have spring practice, so I'm going to make them all run track. Or maybe they ran out of money, didn't have a lot of money, this is a small school. So there's different reasons. So you want to know, why are they losing, why aren't they successful? You can look at maybe the coaching talent, maybe these other factors. Another interesting thing is, they have this relay meet, the Baker Relays. Why don't they have it in World War II? Okay, we know that they can't afford medals and they can't afford these other things. When I looked in the archives, they had brochures for ribbons, because they couldn't afford the medals. They offered ribbons during the early years. And so you can say, okay, why did they do this? Well, we can think about rationing, right? And so there's these things that you can think about when the way you tell sort of a unique local history that'll attach to larger context. One other thing I want to point out here, based on this, is I ran into 1976, 77, 78. There was no track team. Why was there no track team in the middle of the 70s? You said Vietnam. Any other ideas? You said no coach. Any other things you think about happening in the 70s that we might not have track team for? What's going on in the history of sports? Those of you who follow sports. What happens in the 70s? Have you heard of a thing called Title IX? Title IX is Title IX of the Federal Education Act of 1972 that requires that you cannot discriminate based on sex or gender. And it requires the creation of female sports, but the way it's implemented is you have to have proportional equality. And so what happens is, instead of adding female teams, a lot of times they'll get rid of a men's team. And so in 1976, they got rid of track and field because of Title IX. But it comes back in 1979. There's a fun story about that. It comes back because a guy whose son was on the team was real mad about it, and he donates $10,000 for every year for his 4 years that his son was in college to restart the track and field program, under the condition that they add a women's program. And so you can think about, okay, there's this interesting history about gender equity involved in a local history here, and it'll show up in the research. This is a really basic level. You put it online, you do this research that only I was going to read, and now my other alumni are very interested in it. So So one part is I did the results. Another part you could write a profile. So here's a paragraph about each coach. You can find photos of the coaches and show them so you know what they look like. Some of them you can't find a lot about. So this guy has a sentence. Some of them have more. Some have multiple paragraphs. But you can sort of think about, okay, how can I make this as a resource, not just for me, but for a larger public? And so this is one of the promises of taking some research that you've done, a paper you've written, and giving it a second life online. One other component I like to show, because it's really fun, is how many of you have been to a track and field meet? How many of you ran in a relay? So back in the 30s and the 20s, they had these things called relay carnivals, which is basically, it's a big relay meet. Everybody gets a medal. You have teams and all sorts of things. Baker University had a really famous one that is mostly for high schoolers. It was a recruiting tool. But I've put together sort of a history of that meet. I found the medals in the archive, so you can take material culture like a medal, and so this is a medal from the early 2000s, and I can compare that medal to what it looked like. And these medals are from, I think, about the 40s or 50s, or I think they're the 50s, right here at the bottom. So you can sort of see how they changed the medals, how's the logo changed, and it's sort of an interesting material culture thing. And I get people that ran in the meet that still have their medals, and they find the website and they email me. They're telling me, like, I remember this is one of the best things in my high school career, from my college career, coming to Baker and running in this meet. And so there's a way that you can sort of connect to the community. How many people? Does Ohio Northern have a track team? Do you guys have a meet like this?
They have meets all the time for like
Yeah, or for like high schoolers even.
I don't know high school one. We have meets a lot. They do.
So this is a way where you could connect with the school. Like, so how many of you in the school have come to Ohio Northern for a track meet? Do they give you cool medals? I think they've kind of done away with medals. I don't know. But this is a way where you could connect the history of Ohio Northern to the history of your high school. You could do it where you talk about a team. You could go interview your team that came to Ohio Northern, and they could talk about what it was like coming to campus. And so I haven't expanded this because I'm not at Baker anymore, but if I were, I could go back and I could research who came to the school, and I could talk about the history of this meet. And so you could take a sports event and you could talk about both sides, not just who played, but who's the fans. So again, as I said earlier, we talk about the winners, we talk about the coaches, we talk about the star players. We don't get a lot of history interviews with the fans. Like Jen was saying, she likes to show the crowds, the photos, to recreate the event. You can recreate the event by interviewing fans and getting their perspective. What was it like to come and compete at this meet? What was it like to win a medal when that doesn't always happen? So this is one way of doing it. Large scale, I think that if you have a bunch of people who are working on this, you could tell the history of the entire athletic program. You could do one on each sport. You could do one on different games. You could do one on different meets. And that could tell the history of this entire university's athletic program. I think you could do the same thing with your high school teams, though, right? Most high school teams have been around almost 100 years. So when did they first start running track? When they first started playing basketball or football at Lima High School? Does anybody know? Lima, I'm sorry. I'm thinking Lima like Peru, right? I'm not from Ohio, that's right. My apologies. So when did you guys start playing sports? Do you know? I don't know. And so this is that first early type of history, is historical recording. You go back, you look at the newspapers, you put it together, you compile a history, and this is a very basic way that you can create a really interesting dynamic sport history. And then once you put it up there, you can get people, community involved, like the Ferguson Project. People can talk about their stories. They can talk about, okay, here's medals that I won, here's games that I won, here's photos from when I was competing. And this is a way where you can build a community project based around something like sports that tells the history of gender, it tells the history of war, it tells the history of perhaps race, and these other things involved there. And so it's not just about winners and losers, it's about who's involved, how does sport represent our community. What is the mascot in Lima? Spartans. Why did they choose the Spartans? You don't know. I don't know why they chose the Wildcats. Well, actually, I do know why they chose the Wildcats. I know why they chose the Boilermakers. So at Purdue. So Purdue was playing Wabash, a small college, a D3 college in Indiana, and Purdue beat them so bad that they thought they were a bunch of engineers. They thought they were Boilermakers. These big guys so they thought they were ringers, basically. They thought they were paid players to come in so they could beat them. And so they called them Boilermakers, basically accusing them of cheating. Purdue thought that was flattering, and they've become the Boilermakers ever since. There's similar things. So there's histories of mascots. Not just mascots like Native American mascots that are offensive, but there's also histories of mascots like the Boilermakers or the Wildcats. So during this period, where they became the Wildcats, they used to call people who were strike breakers. So one of the trustees owned a mine in eastern Kansas, and there's a strike, and he used students to go and break the strike, and so they called them Wildcatters, because Wildcatters are the people who break strikes. And so there's these nicknames that sort of get attached to things because of these interesting histories. So it'd be fascinating to see, okay, why did they decide to call themselves the Spartans? Is it just because they were inspired by Greece, ancient Greece, and they thought they were great warriors? Perhaps. But maybe there's a debate over why we're going to be this mascot. Sometimes it's just a voting contest, right? Like you hear about new sports teams, they have a poll in the paper. I'm trying to think of a recent one. When there's an expansion team, like there's a newspaper poll, who's going to be the new sports team. You might look who's the runner-up, and you could write a counterfactual history. What if we weren't the Spartans? What were the Athenians? Or what were if we were the Tigers or something? Like everybody is the Tigers. So you could think about this debate around mascots as being, this is the symbol of your community. Most people think about themselves as their high school sports team. They think about that as the center of town. And so you can see how does that come to be by doing this type of research and then making it and giving it back to the community, having the community involved in shaping it. So this is one way that you make digital sport history a community effort. So this is the way you do it somewhat individually. There's other ways that you can do it. So I spent time with the University of Nevada. I did my master's at the University of Nevada in Reno. Nevada is an interesting place, those of you who haven't been. If you go to the right county, just about everything is legal. That's what I tell people. You have to go to the right county. You have to know where to go. But a professor of mine, when I was there, taught a class about the history of the University of Nevada. This is the class. They all wrote about 1,000 words about something they were interested in. So it could be sports. It could be, let's see. So some of them wrote about sports. Some of them wrote about the College of Agriculture. I don't know, that doesn't sound super interesting to me, but maybe you're interested in agriculture. Somebody wanted to be an engineer, or they were an engineering major, so they wrote about the history of engineering. So Nevada's a land-grant school. They found the original engineering building. They talked about these different things. So this is a way where you can take a little single piece about where you're from and write a short piece. And if you and 10 of your friends all do a little different piece, you can combine it to make a larger story. So if you're thinking my sports example, if one of you wanted to write about track, one of you wanted to write about basketball, one of you wanted to write about football, you put it together, you have the history of your entire athletic program. And so this is a really fun way, again, to sort of make it a community project, but also to sort of get involved, to learn about where you're from. One of the first things I do when I go to a place, I ask, who lives here? What do they grow here? What do they work? What's the job here? So to understand a community, you have to understand who's the people there. Why did they come here? So this morning when I got here, I walked around campus and I sort of looked around and I noticed some of the old architecture, and I sort of had this, I was trying to think about, okay, why did people come to Ada, Ohio? I didn't see a lot of there's in the business, so I assume most people here is a farming community. I don't know. What do people do in Ada, Ohio for fun? Or what do they do in Lima, Ohio for fun? The mall? You guys have a mall, okay. So what do people do for work? Factories?
We have a plant that's in Poland.
So you have different plants?
We also have a refinery group, and we're also big on trains.
Okay, trains, railroad. Yeah, so if you see railroad tracks, so I came to Ada, and I didn't go through Lima when I came here, but you see railroad tracks. So if you're a railroad town, you can say, okay, this is what brought people here. You can think about history based on the landscape. And so you see in these photos, you have a lot of buildings. The buildings sort of tell your history, but if you want to get that sense of place, you want to capture that sense of place. And so digital history is a way to sort of recreate a place. And Dr. Giuliano talked a lot about this with with imaging, with recreating things. But you could look, okay, where's the railroad? Sometimes you have an old railroad depot. You'll have all these things that'll help you create your sense of place. Or your football stadium, right? You guys have an old stadium? Do you have a new stadium? Kind of all, just had to get it fixed. So there's a story there, right?
Foundation on the old stadium, it cracked, and then they had to take down the original cement one, and they rebuilt it like
2013. So you guys, basically you had a problem, structural problem, you had to rebuild the stadium. How old was the original one? Since the 30s. Was it a WPA project? So there's a history there, right? So the sort of switch back to Baker University, their stadium, I have photos of them building it. And it was built by students. Students could build it in exchange for their tuition. So you think you have a bad work study job, right? Like you had to like haul stones and stack them. They did this in the mid-30s because there was Depression era, right? So you think about your history of your stadium, not just the story about hey, why did it, you had to rebuild it, that's a story, but also, okay, you have the WPA, you had people working, you have the Depression era. So there's another way you can make sport history tell a larger story. And another way that if you use photos, you can make it real. You can recreate, okay, this is what it looked like then, this is what it looks like now. You can show change over time, which is a central component of all historians. We're trying to show change over time. But you can do that again with the landscape. So I want to show you a few different projects. So the Nevada one's interesting. Who likes boxing? Nobody likes boxing, maybe? Boxing's kind of a dead sport, right? Have you all heard of, yeah, I mean it is. Nobody watches boxing. What is it, Mayweather-Pacquiao? It was a huge disappointment, right? You think it was rigged? Is that what you said? They just hugged. Oh yeah, they just hugged, right, yeah. Have you guys heard of Jack Johnson? Jack Johnson was the first African-American heavyweight boxer. He won the title in 1908, but Americans didn't like it. They wanted to find a white guy because they didn't think that. So the thought process of white supremacy meant that if we had a black champion, that threatened white supremacy because that means a black man is tougher than a white man, and that didn't work in the culture of that era. So they went on a journey to find a great white hope, and they tried to bring back all these guys to defeat him. In 1910, they had a big fight in Reno, the Johnson-Jeffries fight. At Nevada, there's photos of it. Of here, you can look at the stadium, you can look at the rings. So here's the photos of the ringside, if it loads. Take a second. But here's another way where you can take an interesting, a very significant fight, and you can piece together the story with images, with newspapers. You can show, you guys probably haven't ever had to do microfilm research, right? I don't even want to do microfilm research anymore. It's a thing in the library where there's like all the old ladies, like they're reeling.
Oh, I've seen some people doing that in the library.
But you can take photos of your microfilm and you can put them on here. So this is the recreation, sort of talking about, like Dr. Julian was talking about, recreating the stand. So you can see what it was like to be there for the fight. They built a wooden ring about a month before. It's a big wooden ring, a big stadium here in Reno. And so this is another thing you can do is you can take images and pan them over to show them like they're moving. So it's like a documentary, but not quite. Let's see. I might not have it here. So Jack Johnson wins because he's the best. So here's a photo of Johnson sort of towering over Jim Jeffries. And this will take you through the archives here in the University of Nevada. So there's Johnson and Jeffries. He's a big guy. He does pretty well. So again, here's another way where you can take an event and make it into, using these digital projects, you can make it into something more interesting than just this. My advisor at Purdue wrote a book about this. It's about 300 pages. I'd much rather go to the website, right? How about you guys? You'd much rather go read the website than you would read a book? No? Depends on the subject. Okay. Because that's sort of my segue to the next major project that I do is I run the Sport and American History blog, ussporthistory.com. And we write various pieces about the history of sport, about a couple thousand words. We publish a couple times a week. And this is a way that you can alternatively publish things that it's not going to go in a journal, it's not going to go in a book. It's a short piece of research. So this is about the women's hockey. There's a potential merger between two different women's hockey leagues, talking about the challenges of that. And so we'll trace the history there. That's how some people do it. I write more about college football. I'll show you some of the stuff that I've done here in a second. So we did things about Ali. But this is the place, if you're interested in sport history, if you're interested in sharing your work, instead of just giving your paper to your teacher and throwing it away, you can think about alternative places to publish it, people that will help you revise it, etc. So this is another form of digital sport history, of taking work that you've done, research you've done, and figuring out how can we put it online and turn it into almost like a magazine or a blog format. I do this with some of my dissertation, which is on college football in Oklahoma. Let's see if I can find a post here. It's been a while. So I write about college football in Oklahoma. So I take this is about sanity, subsidy, and ransom. So there's this story, and I'll give you sort of the overview of the piece. Back in the 1940s, there was no rules about recruiting. There's a guy that Oklahoma really wanted. He went to Oklahoma City High School, or Capitol Hill High School in Oklahoma. And Oklahoma gave him a job. They're like, we'll give you a summer job in order for you to come to Oklahoma. And then they gave his girlfriend a summer job because she needed one too, because everybody needs money, right? So they gave her a job. And then come August, when it's time for him to come up to practice, he doesn't show up. Where'd he go? He went to Arkansas. Because Oklahoma gave him a job and his girlfriend a job. Arkansas bought his dad a new Buick and promised him, $100 a week. In 1946, that's good money, right? $100 a week is good money now. So they promised to give them, and they bought his dad a $4,000 car. $4,000 then, it's a lot now, right? I'm not good at math. This is why I'm a historian. But anyway, so what happens is they offer him all this money, and he doesn't come to Oklahoma. And then Oklahoma's like, well, why didn't you come here? And they're like, well, I felt so guilty. I couldn't, because they bought my dad a car. I can't say no now. So Oklahoma had a bunch of rich boosters pay for his dad's car and ransom him from Arkansas so he could come back to Oklahoma. And this is the foundation of what becomes known as the Touchdown Club. And the Touchdown Club is the booster organization that pays for the scholarships and all these things. And so out of this ransom, out of this lawlessness of recruiting, we think recruiting is bad now, right? You think about everybody, Reggie Bush and all that stuff, right? Do you guys remember Reggie Bush? That might have been too long ago. He was a big USCA running back who lost his eligibility because of getting extra benefits. But anyway, so this is the mid-50s, or mid-40s. Anybody could do this. And so this is what leads to the creation of the NCAA probation. And so this is part of what my research is about. But I tell this story. People will use it in their class. I have friends that study Oklahoma, or people in Oklahoma read this. It's a history that they don't know. So you can start with a little interesting hook like that. You can share it. This is a research paper that you may write in your own classes, if your teacher lets you. I don't know if Russ will let you do it in his class, I know that. But then I take a picture of some of my sources. So this is a magazine that talks about the ransoming. I think I have another photo. Here's a picture of the actual player, way back when. And so you can mix it in there and you can publish it on a platform like this and get your research out there, get your information out there. And so it's a kind of an interesting story that leads to a bunch of changes in the NCAA's framework and the way they think about eligibility and the way they didn't even have probation until about 1953. So Oklahoma eventually gets punished for something they did like 7 years earlier. They're one of the first universities on NCAA probation. So there's a way that you can sort of take this interesting information and put it in online, a way of taking your research and making it public. A lot of my work is done in the area of digital, what I would call digital public history. I do my research and I use digital tools and digital publication to make it in terms of public history. And so it's not just me, it's community, it's readers. Our website gets about, it's not super popular. We probably get about 7,000 to 10,000 views a month. Last year we had around 85,000 views, so we're not like a newspaper, we're not huge, but for if you're going from an audience of 1 or 2 for your teacher to that's a pretty solid idea. And I think it's comparable. I don't have numbers It's definitely probably equal to or a little bit better than publishing it in a journal, an academic journal. So you think about the impact of this. It's there, but it's not quite there. It's an emerging area still. The other thing that we can do, we can talk about mapping. And so sort of another part of my project is Oklahoma. How many of you read John Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath? How many of you were supposed to read it? I was one of the people who was supposed to read it. I didn't read it until much later. SparkNotes is your friend sometimes. I don't know if I'm supposed to encourage that. I'm sorry, Russ. But so the Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck outlines this idea of the Okie. You've heard of Okies? Now it's a person from Oklahoma. But back then it was a pejorative person. It's a negative connotation. If you're an Okie, you're lazy, you live in squalor, you're no good. What happens is, during the Great Depression, Oklahoma has the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression at the same time. People leave, they get on their jalopies. Have you seen the movie Grapes of Wrath? Because I did that. I watched the movie. It comes out later on. But Grapes of Wrath won a Pulitzer Prize. It was a really great book. And he talks about the desolation of Oklahoma. He talks about Oklahoma people as being these terrible people that come to California and try to steal all these jobs. Basically, Okies are like the way people talk about immigrants now in some ways, in a very negative term. Oklahoma wasn't, I don't know, sorry about this. Oklahoma wasn't a big fan of this Okie image. And so part of their strategy to make sure that we're not recognized as Okies was to create a really, really good football team. Because football acts as a great form of public relations, right? If you have a winning team and you're in the top 10 every year and you're in the newspaper, people are going to know you because they're going to know, oh, that's Oklahoma football. Okay. Oklahoma's still known for football, I think. But in the mid-1950s, they won 31 consecutive games from 1948 to 1950 and a national championship. And from 1953 to 1957, they won 47 consecutive games. And that includes a tie in that streak. So there's 47 consecutive wins, 48 if you count the tie for undefeated. And so during this period, they're recognized as the best football program ever. This is also during the era where you had to play both ways. So now, schools will play, they'll win 20, 30 games a year, like Alabama, and then they'll lose in, the championship game or something. But we're not playing both ways. We're playing 14, 15 games a season. They're playing 8 or 9 games a season, 10 if you're lucky. So over 5 seasons, they don't win. So they're trying to use football to make themselves a better state, to give them a better reputation. Part of this strategy, and here's what I have on the map, is, let's skip back to the beginning. Part of the strategy is scheduling, so they play games, we'll start with 47. So I start with 47, because this is when they start doing this. And you'll see how the schedule starts in the Midwest, and gradually they'll start moving to the coasts. It'll become a national schedule. And what happens is, they intentionally try to create a national, so every time you play a team, your game, they're going to talk about your team in their local newspaper, right? They're going to talk about your team in the local media outlet. And so if you schedule a game in Boston, in LA, in Indiana, in Ohio, instead of just playing Oklahoma and Kansas and Texas, then you can see their schedule becoming national here. And this is part of their branding, their image, part of making it larger. So what I did was I took the schedule and I geocoded the location of their opponents. I threw it on a map, and this is what happens. And so if you look at there's 17 maps here. If you look at them over time in a slideshow, you can see how the schedule comes from just the Great Plains to a national schedule. And this is one way you can use mapping to sort of show something that you can't necessarily see without the maps, right? So we can talk about it. We know there's this idea here, but if you actually see it, you can confirm that this is what's happening. There's other ways you can do this. A project that I want to do, I haven't started yet, is I want to map the roster. So you can do this with high school too. High school is not going to be as interesting because everybody's usually from that town. But if you wanted to map, say, Ohio State roster, where are most of the kids that go to Ohio State from to play football? They're from everywhere, right? Has that always been the case? Probably not. So if you took the roster, and this is the thing, so archives have all sorts of information, But the roster is one information that historians don't know what to do with. We don't really care who's on the team. We might care about the coach and like a couple star players, but we don't care about like all 80 kids on the Ohio State team. We should, but we don't. And so if you take the roster and a lot of times they'll list the hometown or they'll list the high school. And if you map all of those and you do it over several seasons, you can see where the team is from. You can have a map, like a heat map like this, where you can say this is where Ohio State football represents. This is the national recruiting base. And if you do it all the way back to the 19-teens, they're probably going to all be from Ohio and Michigan and Indiana, the local area. But now you're going to have a bunch of kids from, Texas and Florida and California. And so you can see how recruiting has changed. You could code into that map what position they play. So you can say all the quarterbacks come from this area, or all of the defensive players come from this area. You could code in race. You can say, okay, we're recruiting African Americans from the South coming to Ohio instead of from other places. And so you can see where are these coming from. So you can have a way where you can take a really basic information, and if you add geographic information to it, then you can make a map like this that shows a much larger thing that you can't see. You can assume, but then once you actually see it through mapping shows motion. And so this is another way that you can do sophisticated digital history work centered on sports that shows and helps you understand things in new ways. I'm trying to think of some other things. So Ohio State would be an interesting one to see. You could do the same thing with their schedule. Have they always just played? So they play the Big Ten, but recently the Big Ten has sort of incentivized playing teams outside of the Big Ten, right? So now we have to play power conferences. So Ohio State played Oklahoma last year, and so you can see, okay, has their schedule changed? And maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. I don't know. But this is part of the reason why we can map things. This is the power of digital history, to take things that we might assume and to show them to be true. Now, this is a labor-intensive process. It takes a lot of data entry, but it's actually not that hard. So basically, you get your roster, you type it up, you can go into Google and you find the GPS coordinates from their hometown, and you put that in there, you put it in a spreadsheet, you use the spreadsheet in something like ArcMap GIS, and there's an online free edition called Story Maps, and so you could do this at home, you could map anything you wanted to. So if you had a really good local high school sports team, you could say, okay, well, we're just playing our league, but did we used to go travel more? What happened to the traveling, or different things? And so you could sort of see the reach of the change over time of your community. Has your community gotten larger or smaller based on where people's addresses are, et cetera, where people live? And so you could correspond, if you wanted to work with something like map and inequality, and the roster of your high school team with their address, you could see, okay, how are they from the good neighborhoods or the bad neighborhoods? Where are the good athletes coming from? And there's other interesting sort of dynamics that you could, all sorts of things you can play around with mapping. And so this is another area of really dynamic digital history that we can do here. Let's see, what else was I going to show you? Those of you interested in sort of preservation, your photos, the University of Nevada, I use them because I spent a lot of time there, and I know the folks that are doing this there. So I'm sorry I don't have any Purdue examples necessarily. But the University of Nevada sort of did a visual history of their athletic program. A guy named Marion Motley went to school there. You guys heard of Marion Motley? He played for the Browns. He was one of the first African Americans to reintegrate the NFL in 1946. So the Browns were the first team to reintegrate back then it was the All-American Football Conference. There was a gentleman's agreement from 32 to 46, and Marion Motley was an athlete at Purdue. So here's a photo of Marion Motley playing football at Nevada in the 1930s and 40s. So they've taken, instead of just giving the history, they're just showing you the photos. And so you can use the photos as a primary source to say, okay, what's happening in this interesting photos? There's themes. You can pull out the fan experience, you can pull out the coaches, you can find the interesting photos, you can see who are they talking to, because sometimes there'll be a coach with somebody really interesting. Like maybe the governor is there, and you're like, why is the governor on the football game? And so by using photos, you can use that as an entry point to ask other questions about who's there, why, what's happening in the photo. I'm trying to think. Or again, facilities. I like facilities. I'm a big landscape guy. I like to go and look at the old stadiums. And so here, you can do a tour of, you can put it on the map. So again, they show here's where the maps are, here's where they played. So you can see they used to play right here in the middle of campus. And now they play up here. The stadium has moved to different parts of campus has expanded, et cetera. So you can see this is the Well, it's not there. Okay. So that's one thing. Somebody mentioned the Olympics earlier. 1960, they hosted the Winter Olympics in Squaw Valley. Does anybody know where that's at? It's California / Nevada. It's Lake Tahoe, South Lake Tahoe. And so the Winter Olympics, they used to be in the same year. The summer and the winter used to be in the same year. I think it was the 90s when they switched. But so there's an interesting story here. They tell about the history of the Olympics. There's photos there. The debate about, are we going to host the Olympics here? And so there's other ways where you can sort of rescue something that we may have forgotten about. It seems like the Olympics are one of those things that we care for 4 years, and then 4 years later we don't remember the last 4 years. Unless it's somebody like Usain Bolt, and then we remember everything he ever does. Or maybe that's just me, I'm a track nerd, as you guys can clearly tell. So again, I want to sort of point these out as different ways that you can take your research, or you can work with an archive or historical society or a museum and take their research. There's been studies done that say if you put stuff online, you're going to get much more community reaction. You're going to get people emailing you, asking you questions, or offering their stories. You're going to get more people coming to your museum or to your archive to use your stuff if they see parts of it online and they want to see the rest on your area. So as a form of public history, it can also work as a good tool of marketing. And so you can do things like, so I know not everybody here wants to be a history major, right? We're sort of the weirdos that want to study history, some of us. So if you want to do something like sports information or sports management, you could think about creating stuff like this or compiling data as a way of doing historical research that's relevant in other career tracks, if that makes sense. So I want to show that there's more than just history nerds doing this and sports junkies writing about it online. Do you have any questions? Anything that you guys are interested in about sport history that you want to ask me? I didn't talk about basketball. There's a lot of basketball stuff too. I know it's March Madness. How are you guys' brackets looking? Good. I think I was 12 out of 16. I'm a Nevada guy, and Nevada lost last night, so. Yeah, so any other questions about sport history or digital sport history or digital public history? No, you guys are just wanting for lunch, right? It's lunchtime, just about. If you have any questions about this, about the blog, about how you can map your own stuff, feel free to ask me at lunch or in the hallway or whatever. I'm more than happy to talk about these different ideas. So thanks for your attention.
One table.